May 25, 2025. Inside the low walls of HMP Kirklevington Grange, the morning routine began as it always did. Breakfast trays, movement to workshops, a rhythm designed to feel almost ordinary. But behind one cell door that routine stopped. A man lay still. No noise, no struggle, no warning. The official statement was brief, almost sterile. A prisoner has died in custody. As with all such cases, the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman will investigate. No further detail. No cause of death. No mention of violence. For most names in custody, that would have been the end of it. A line in a report, a number folded into statistics. But this name refused to dissolve into background. The man found dead was Barry Kelly. At just 32 years old, Kelly's sudden death didn't fit. He wasn't frail, he wasn't elderly, he wasn't serving out the quiet end of a forgotten sentence. He was young and until that morning very much alive. 4 years he had been at the center of Liverpool's underworld violence. A figure who survived gang wars, police surveillance, and the kind of takedown that rewrites entire neighborhoods. So how does someone who lived through shootouts, explosives, and a multi-county criminal empire die without a sound in one of the UK's most relaxed prisons? That is the puzzle. HMP Kirklevington Grange was no fortress. It wasn't built for the city's most dangerous or unstable. It was an open prison, a Category D facility where inmates neared the end of their sentences, trusted to work outside during the day and return at night. It was supposed to be a step closer to freedom, not the last chapter of a life. Yet for Barry Kelly, that is exactly what it became. The silence around his death only made the questions louder. No confirmed medical condition. No violence reported. No official cause released. Just an ending that didn't match the chaos of the life that came before. And to understand why that silence felt so unsettling, why this death didn't fade into a statistic, you have to rewind. Back before Kirklevington, before the courts, before the raids. Back to Liverpool. Back to Speke, where Barry Kelly's story first began. To understand the silence of Barry Kelly's death, you have to go back to the noise that shaped his life. Liverpool. A city with two faces, one that built ships, music, and industry, and another that bore the scars when all of that collapsed. By the late 20th century, neighborhoods like Speke felt the full weight of that collapse. The factories closed, the docks emptied, and in the spaces left behind came something else. Rows of shuttered shops, council estates marked by neglect, and streets where opportunity thinned until it vanished. In Speke, poverty wasn't just statistics. It was the texture of daily life. Generations raised in the same cycle. Low prospects, low wages, and promises that never arrived. For young people, the landscape didn't offer many routes forward. And where the state fell short, others stepped in. Gangs became both threat and provider. They offered money, protection, and a sense of belonging in a place where the future felt out of reach. This was the environment Barry Kelly was born into. But unlike others whose names appeared in school reports, youth service notes, or family intervention files, Kelly's early years were marked by something unusual: absence. No stories told by teachers. No documented attempts at rehabilitation. No public record of what shaped him. Just silence. And in Speke, silence didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant something was happening outside the lines people bothered to write down. By the way, if you have enjoyed the story so far, please don't forget to subscribe, like and share this video as it will encourage us to create more videos on UK organized crime. The silence filled quickly. With engines revving down backstreets. With the buzz of cheap burner phones carrying coded calls. With the lure of fast cash and fast respect. For boys like Kelly, the streets became both classroom and career. He never announced himself loudly. No flashy profile, no headlines in youth crime columns. But by the time many of his peers were chasing apprenticeships or moving out of the estate, Kelly had already chosen a different path. A path that demanded loyalty, secrecy, and above all else, control. And in the underworld of Liverpool's South Side, control was the only currency that mattered. By the time Barry Kelly's name began to circulate, Speke was already gripped by a new generation of dealers. They called themselves the East Side Boys, and at first glance, they looked like every other crew trying to carve up territory in Liverpool. Young faces, cheap cars, brash violence. But inside their world, it wasn't just about selling on corners. It was about creating a system, one that could outlast police raids, rival crews, even prison time. At the center of that system stood Eastern Avenue. From the outside, it was just another detached house, one among hundreds in the estate. But behind its steel-reinforced doors, Eastern Avenue became more than an address. It was a fortress, a headquarters, a statement. Residents stopped walking past it. Parents steered children to the other side of the road. Even in silence, the house radiated power. That power was enforced by the Burrows brothers, Jake and Callum. They weren't strategists, they were enforcers, men who built reputations through noise. Loud, visible, violent. When their names moved through Speke, it wasn't whispered, it was spat out with fear. They thrived on spectacle, on being seen and heard. But every regime that survives needs more than fear. It needs structure. And that's where Barry Kelly came in. Kelly wasn't the loudest in the room. He didn't chase headlines or swagger through the estate. What set him apart was something quieter: calculation. He understood the business side of the chaos. The supply lines. The money flow. The pressure points that moved things faster. While the Burrows brothers kept rivals in check through intimidation, Kelly built the invisible scaffolding that held the enterprise together. The East Side Boys didn't operate like a loose pack of teenagers with guns. They ran like an organization. Trap houses became nodes in a network. Couriers moved product like clockwork. Cash was cleaned through car washes and vape shops that looked ordinary from the street but functioned as laundromats for dirty money. Violence wasn't random, it was scheduled, selective, applied where it protected profit. To outsiders it looked like chaos. To those inside it was business logic. The Burrows brothers provided muscle. Kelly provided order. Together they turned a neighborhood gang into something closer to a regime. And like all regimes, their monopoly didn't go unchallenged. By 2017 the air in Speke had changed. What once felt like an ordinary working-class neighborhood began to carry the tension of a minefield. Streets that had been filled with strollers and school runs now felt brittle, as if every corner hid the possibility of violence. It didn't happen all at once. It started with whispers, that another crew was pushing in, testing the boundaries of the East Side Boys. At first it was just movement, new faces on familiar corners, cars that didn't belong. But in Speke, lines were not drawn on maps. They were drawn in blood. When the first shots rang out near Eastern Avenue, it wasn't just an attack. It was a message. A man dropped in the street just seconds after children had entered the building. By chance or miracle, the children were unharmed. But the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Everyone knew what came next. Retaliation. From that moment, daily life in Speke began to fracture. Parents rushed children home at the sound of an engine revving. Commuters chose longer routes to avoid certain blocks. Windows stayed closed even on hot nights. Ordinary people, with no stake in the feud, were trapped in a battleground they never chose. The East Side Boys responded with precision wrapped in brutality. A high-powered hunting rifle fired through a rival's letterbox. Cars ambushed at stoplights. Doors kicked in before dawn. Violence wasn't random anymore. It was strategic, designed to remind everyone who owned the streets. And in the middle of that storm, Barry Kelly began to emerge as more than just a name on the periphery. He wasn't the one shouting threats on corners or firing shots in broad daylight. That was left to others. Kelly was the one trusted when things needed to be clean, precise, effective. While the Burrows brothers carried the weight of spectacle, Kelly carried the weight of control. He tracked movements, arranged drop-offs, and ensured that while the feud painted Speke red, the flow of business never stopped. Drugs still moved. Money still washed. Even in chaos the system ran. For residents the cost was suffocating. The neighborhood became a pressure cooker, where fear pressed against every wall and silence replaced laughter on the streets. What had once been a community now felt like a front line. And at its center, Kelly's quiet hand guided the regime through a war that was only just beginning. Before we continue, don't forget that what you are watching took us hours of both research, editing and voicing to able to get it across to you. We plead that you show us your support by just subscribing to this channel and liking this video, as it will encourage us to create more video like this. Thank you. While gunfire echoed through Speke, another kind of war was being fought in silence. Not with bullets but with microphones. Not in alleys but in briefing rooms. In March 2017, while rival crews lit up the streets, Merseyside police set something in motion that would never make the evening news until it was ready. They called it Operation Bombay. To the outside it wasn't a raid or a mass arrest. It was patience. A long con disguised as quiet. Detectives began threading themselves through the fabric of the East Side Boys' world. Phones were tapped. Vans with tinted windows parked just out of sight. Conversations once thought private were captured in grainy audio. Informants were activated, people already inside the network whose debts or fears made them pliable. One by one details surfaced. Names. Drop points. Vehicles. Times. It became less about stopping the next shooting and more about mapping an entire organism. Who supplied the weapons? Who cleaned the money? Who kept the couriers moving? Each conversation was a move on a hidden chessboard. Each response a counter. And in that match, Barry Kelly stood out. He wasn't loud enough to draw early attention, but his fingerprints were everywhere. A call connecting one drop to the next. A meeting that linked narcotics in Liverpool to firearms in Nottingham. Quiet enough not to notice at first, but constant enough that investigators realized he was the link in the chain. Kelly wasn't the general, but he was the logistics officer. The one who kept the wheels turning while others brandished guns. Guns came in, drugs went out, and Kelly was the hinge that connected both sides of the door. The longer police listened, the clearer it became. Operation Bombay wasn't just about watching a gang. It was about understanding its rhythm. Detectives learned when couriers swapped cars, how stash houses emptied hours before raids, why encrypted phones rotated weekly. It was a system designed to be invisible, until someone stayed patient enough to follow the threads. And that patience paid off. After 14 months of silence, the blueprint was complete. The East Side Boys were no longer just a neighborhood gang. They were mapped as a criminal infrastructure stretching across counties. And Barry Kelly, the quiet strategist in the shadows, was no longer just a name. He was the crucial link that made the entire network visible. Just before sunrise, the city held its breath. Across 5 counties, convoys of unmarked vans rolled into position. Curtains stayed drawn. Streets still slept. Then, in perfect sequence, doors flew open. 31 addresses. Dozens of teams. One synchronized strike. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Steel doors breached, stairwells flooded, commands barked in low, clipped voices. Stash houses emptied before their owners could react. Encrypted phones rang once, then never again. Couriers who had driven the same routes for months suddenly found the roads closed, their lines severed in an instant. What had felt untouchable the night before now unraveled in a single morning. 10 firearms. Thousands of rounds of ammunition. Explosives. A stockpile of Class A and B narcotics. Pulled from cupboards, car boots, and false walls. The East Side Boys didn't just lose members that day, they lost their infrastructure. The rhythm that kept money moving, drugs supplied, and weapons flowing simply stopped. By mid-morning, the names that once haunted Speke were in custody. Jake and Callum Burrows. Christopher Wallace. Joanne Ritchie. And Barry Kelly. No gunfire. No standoff. Just silence. The silence of a machine dismantled piece by piece until nothing was left moving. For the first time in years, the streets of Speke were still. The raids ended the movement, but it was in the courtroom where the empire was truly unmasked. Over the months that followed, names once spoken only in whispers filled the charge sheets. 22 defendants. 4 separate trials. The evidence laid out not as fragments, but as a blueprint of how an entire system had operated in plain sight. Firearms trafficking. Class A and Class B distribution. Explosives concealed in garages. Couriers driving hundreds of miles with hidden compartments. Money washed through legitimate businesses that were anything but legitimate. It wasn't just crime, it was infrastructure. And at the center of those charge sheets sat Barry Kelly. When his moment came, he didn't resist. No jury battle, no elaborate defense. Just a guilty plea. A quiet admission that confirmed what detectives had suspected all along. Kelly had been more than a runner, more than a name in the margins. He had been a link, a strategist, the man who kept the machine turning. But the silence of his plea left its own questions. Why didn't he fight? Did he already know the outcome? Or did he understand that the network he helped build was too deeply exposed to deny? When sentences were delivered, they landed with heavy weight. The Burrows brothers, 25 years for Jake, 20 for Callum. Christopher Wallace, the bomb maker, condemned to life with a minimum of 31 years. Suppliers and enforcers scattered across the Midlands and Merseyside handed terms stretching into decades. In total, over 300 years of prison time fell across the network. A statement not just of punishment but of closure. And then there was Kelly. 18 years. Long enough to strip away the prime of his life, but for a man tied to weapons, narcotics, and organized violence across counties, it felt oddly light. A sentence that looked heavy on paper, yet carried a question beneath it. Why so little for someone who held so much together? It was a question that would follow him all the way to his cell door. When the cell doors closed in 2019, Barry Kelly was 26 years old and staring down the weight of an 18-year sentence. For someone tied to firearms, explosives, and a county-spanning drug network, the placement made sense at first. He was housed in high-security conditions, surrounded by walls built for men considered too dangerous to trust with anything less. And for a while that's where he stayed. The system expected volatility, disciplinary reports, altercations, the same violence that had defined his life on the outside. But the reports never came. No fights. No headlines. No chaos. Kelly, it seemed, went quiet. Then gradually his circumstances shifted. From high security to lower categories, until eventually by 2025, Kelly was transferred to HMP Kirklevington Grange in North Yorkshire, a Category D open prison. A facility where inmates are trusted to work outside during the day, return at night and prepare for release. It was the kind of placement reserved for low-risk offenders. Men on their way out. Shoplifters. Fraudsters. Petty dealers. Not a convicted gun runner linked to bomb makers and gang wars. So how does someone with Kelly's record end up in one of the most relaxed prisons in the system? Theories circulated quietly. Some believed he had earned it through good behavior, the steady record of a prisoner who followed rules and waited his time. Others suggested something less visible, cooperation. That Kelly, once at the center of a vast network, may have traded information for leniency, a bargain never written into headlines but reflected in his transfer. There was a third possibility, the most mundane but also the most unsettling. That it was simply a system failure. An overworked classification process, a misjudgment that sent a man with a violent past into an environment built on trust. Whatever the reason, the move left a lingering puzzle. In the span of just 6 years, Barry Kelly had gone from a fortified gang regime in Speke to one of the softest prison environments in the UK. A man once treated as a high-risk target was suddenly living under minimal security, his path toward release seemingly open. It was a strange quiet. Too quiet. And it would not last long. May 25, 2025. The quiet of HMP Kirklevington Grange was broken by a single discovery: Barry Kelly, unresponsive in his cell. He was just 32 years old. The statement that followed was as brief as it was hollow. A prisoner has died in custody. The Prisons and Probation Ombudsman will investigate. No cause. No context. No clarity. And that silence raised more questions than it answered. Kelly had survived street wars, gun deals, and a sweeping police operation that dismantled an empire. He had walked through violence that claimed others, endured raids designed to crush him, and outlasted rival crews that had been buried by the same feud. Yet here, in one of the safest prisons in the UK, he died quietly without warning. So what happened? One theory points to the simplest explanation: a hidden health issue. Something undiagnosed, sudden, the kind of failure that offers no signs until it is too late. But Kelly's record carried no mention of medical concerns, and his age made the idea feel unlikely, if not impossible. Others suggest an overdose. Contraband moved easily through open prisons, and Kelly's history with smuggling inside institutions made the irony almost cruel. Had he miscalculated, taken something meant to numb the time only for it to end everything? Another possibility cuts deeper. Suicide. 18 years is a heavy sentence, even heavier when you're barely into your 30s. For a man who once thrived on control, the silence of prison might have been unbearable. Was his final act one of surrender? Or was it something no one saw coming? But there is a fourth theory. One that refuses to fade in Liverpool's pubs, in online forums, in the quiet conversations of those who knew his name. That Kelly was silenced. Not by despair or chance but by design. He had been the strategist, the link between suppliers, weapons and money flows that stretched across counties. He knew names, routes, accounts, details that had never reached a courtroom. Had he become a liability, a loose thread someone wanted cut before it unraveled further? The prison service insists there was no foul play. No signs of assault. No violent disturbance. But for many, the facts and the setting don't align. Barry Kelly did not fall in a hail of bullets or a bloody feud on the streets. He died in the quietest prison wing in the system. And that quiet to this day does not fit. Today the streets of Liverpool are quieter. The gunfire that once rattled through Speke has faded. Children walk to school without crossing the street to avoid Eastern Avenue. Parents breathe easier, no longer glancing over their shoulders at every engine that slows. But the silence left behind by Barry Kelly's death is louder than the noise that defined his life. For years, his name was tied to chaos, firearms, narcotics, and a regime that turned ordinary streets into a battlefield. He rose quietly, operated precisely, and became a figure investigators could not ignore. His fall was inevitable. His sentence heavy. Yet the way his story ended refuses to settle into clarity. A man who outlived bullets, raids, and betrayal died in the calmest prison setting the system could offer. No gunfight. No ambush. Just silence. And that silence still echoes, through court records, through online debates, through the unanswered questions that circle his name. Kelly's story is not simply one of ambition and collapse. It is a story about what remains hidden. About how a network that once spanned counties may still hold secrets never spoken aloud. And about how even in death, some figures leave behind more uncertainty than certainty. Liverpool may have reclaimed its streets, but the mystery surrounding Barry Kelly lingers like an unfinished sentence. His life was defined by control, yet his death is defined by the absence of answers. And sometimes the quietest endings leave the loudest questions.